Welcome back, guys. I know it's not a 308 episode and you're upset about it. The next one will be, I promise you that. But as mentioned in the last Hot Rod episode, we've only got 1 week left as of today to get this thing up and running and driving. So I've been working really hard on it. Let me show you what I've gotten done over the last few days. First on the list for the weekend was to get the exhaust system installed on the Model A. Seeing as there's no fenders or engine bay in the way, this seems like it should be a pretty easy task, but unfortunately the complexity of the headers makes it a rather large challenge to get to each and every bolt to actually attach these to the cylinder head. The top row of bolts is honestly easy enough, a ratcheting wrench does the trick, but it's getting to the bottom ones where the tubes actually curve down towards the bolts that makes it rather tough. It's one of those situations where an open-end wrench must be turned an eighth turn at a time until they're sunk all the way down. For whatever reason, the header on the driver's side of the truck didn't want to bolt on, and I don't know whether it's a difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2 cylinder head header bolt patterns, or if perhaps the header flange warped somewhat. Opening up all of the holes about a 1/16 of an inch did give it the clearance needed, and I was able to install it without much further issue. The challenge of installing the headers is only because of the access to the bolts, but installing the crossover pipes underneath the chassis is a different challenge entirely. And that's mostly because actually seating the V-bands is a bit of a challenge. You can't see much because the wheels are in the way of the actual view here, but it's a two-person job, and I was fortunate that John was around to lend a hand. We got the whole system installed, and this is the result. One of the coolest exhaust systems out there. Now, I do need to give credit where credit is due. I may have built the rest of this truck in its entirety, but these headers were built by Riley Stair, my former business partner when we were operating Proto Machine. These headers are loosely equal length, but they're more for the outright style and sound, and trust me, it's absolutely unreal. It's my favorite part of this truck. The exhaust system is impossible to ignore, both visibly and audibly. Now, for clarity's sake, these 4 cylinders on this side of the engine do not exit from this pipe here. They actually exit on the other side of the car, and this pipe here is for the opposite bank. Now, although they do cross over underneath, they don't merge because the pipes are pointed at each other and it wouldn't work very well. The other question I want to answer is, I know some of you guys have asked, what are these springs for? And the simple answer is it's to hold the thing together. This collector is not welded to the primaries, and that's a construction constraint. It wouldn't be possible to fully weld it, and if it were welded, it would be impossible to fully weld the exhaust itself. So instead, this is a slip fit, and there's a spring on each primary to hold it together. I'm not really ever going to remove this if I don't have to. It's quite tough to assemble, so we just leave these together and instead separate the exhaust with the V-band down here. Next on the list is making some revisions to the water-to-air cooling system for the Supercharger. Let me explain some of my thought process to you and see where we get. Now, one thing that I do want to change about our setup from the last time I had a motor in this thing is the fact that the entire Supercharger cooling system is run with rubber hoses. Some of it has AN fittings, this push lock type of stuff, because the cooler has AN ports on it, but the intercooler itself has hose barbs, and then the water pump that I'm using for this, right here, also has plastic hose barbs. So it necessitates just using rubber hose and hose clamps, and it doesn't really look very good. I don't like it, but I realized we can swap out the water pump for one with AN ports on it. This is actually the pump from the Ferrari that we're using for the water-to-air intercooler. It's a very similar setup on the Ford motor, so I'm just gonna borrow this pump for now, and we'll order another one for the 308. And the only other part of this that we're gonna need to change is the fact that the fittings going into the intercooler underneath the blower have steel hose barbs on them. So I realize they unbolt. We're gonna unbolt these, press out the steel, and see if we can thread and tap the aluminum appropriately to put an ORB fitting in and adapt these to AN. So I got them out, and they're definitely a little bit more complicated than I thought, although this piece comes out and it's just held in place by O-rings. So what I'm gonna try now is to tap the steel piece out. We'll see if I can do it without damaging this thing. We'll remove the O-ring while we're at it. If I can get it off with one hand on camera, look at that. So let's see if we can tap that out and then see if we have room to drill and tap the center of this. And then figure out how to flush the system, because it should not look like that. For heat, I'm using one of my favorite but most simple tools in the entire shop, a MAP gas torch. But I gotta be careful not to overheat this part, as it is cast aluminum with mating surfaces. The goal with the heat is to simply loosen the anaerobic sealant between the steel insert and the aluminum core. And once I got it hot, a pair of pliers was able to break that sealant by simply twisting it. Now I wasn't able to pull it out at this point, so I used a 13mm socket that made contact only with the steel insert and not the aluminum around it. That brings us over to the lathe, which you guys have seen in plenty of episodes before, and I've admitted that I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to using this thing, but my buddy and machinist Brett Walker from Nimmo Machine came over and spent some time really dialing in this lathe and giving me a full walkthrough on a lot of the basics needed to perform some simple tasks, such as the changes we need to make to these aluminum fittings. I never would have been able to accomplish this without Brett's help. Now for the curious, we did a few facing operations, but our main focus was to bore out the center of the fitting and then to give ourselves a recess for the O-ring and a chamfer to allow that O-ring to seat. Last but not least was to thread the inside of this part so that we could attach an ORB-AN fitting like you see here. This is the finished result, and it's exactly what I set out to make. I'm really happy with the result, and although this machining process is admittedly quite simple to do, I'm a newbie at this, and I'm really happy with the outcome. I feel like I learned a ton, and I'm excited to tackle more projects like this one, especially when they turn out this well. With these changes, we can now run AN lines to provide coolant to and from the supercharger. This coolant will keep our intake air temperatures down and help us make more horsepower. But it's not the only thing that we need to change. Back to this tank that I'm using to actually add water to the coolant system. You'll see it's got hose barbs on it, and that won't allow us to attach AN fittings, as explained before. First, I cut off the ends of the barbs, thinking I'd weld -12 bungs to the raised material, but I decided to do this the right way and cut them all the way down to the base of the end tank. I wanted to make sure I could open up the holes in the end to allow for maximum coolant flow. I'm still having fun as I learn this aluminum welding process, and when I was finished with this, I did do a leak test and only had one spot where a tiny weep hole had formed, but after a second pass, everything seems to hold water just fine, but the ultimate test will be once we get this thing installed on the car. The last aspect of this coolant tank build is to add a bracket to the side. Previously, I just had this zip tied to the side of the supercharger, but this time I'd like to bolt it down properly. Last on the list for revisions of this supercharger cooling system is to update the water pump. Now, mounting this was the easiest thing I've done so far. I didn't even need to make a bracket. I simply drilled 2 holes through the firewall and bolted it straight on. It's hidden nicely behind the engine where it's mostly out of sight and out of mind, but it'll keep the plumbing nice and short and should keep this system nice and simple. Now I know the water pump mounting location is kind of odd, and some of you guys might say, why don't you find somewhere more discreet to put it? But it's important to remember there is no hiding anything on this truck. There's no room for it, and all of the V6 Charger owners. What spare room there is on this thing, I have used up completely. Essentially, we have where the engine is in the front, and there's, 8 or so inches to work with behind the front grille, but we've got headlights hiding back there, and a full heat exchanger for the supercharger. We've also got our intake plumbed down in there, lots of AN hosing, things like that. Inside the cabin, there is no room except for what's under the cowl, and that's full of electronics. And then at the back of the truck, there is some space behind the cab, between the cab and the radiator, but it's full of stuff too. There are, let's see, well, I'll just show you. I need to do some cleanup back here, but we've got a pump for the transmission, and here we have a dual cooler from CSF. It's a pretty neat unit. It cools 2 fluids at once with a separator. So on this side, we've got our transmission, and then on this side, we've got engine oil. So that cooler is back here. We've got our oil filter, remote oil filter set up. And then on the other side, we've got an electric water pump buried right there for the radiator. We've got one lift pump for the fuel system here, and then another one buried way down there. So in short, there is no room in the back of this thing to hide anything else really. We'd interrupt flow for the radiator or just be cramming things down at the bottom. And honestly, I need to come in here and try to clean up some of this wiring anyways. I mean, it's tidy-ish, but it could be better. So that's why we've mounted it here in the front. I don't think anybody will really see it, to be honest. There's a lot more to look at than a tiny pump mounted behind the motor anyway. Next on the list is getting the intake installed. There's nothing special about this one. It's the same intake I've run since we built this thing. It's made of 4-inch stainless steel tubing, and I chose that material because I wanted it to match the look of the headers. The intake itself dips down below the small hood that runs in front of the engine when the front end is on the truck, and there is a small shield around the filter, which is to help with MAF wash. We struggled with the MAF signal a lot when we first went to tune this thing, and this small shield made a huge difference. From the factory, Coyotes run one of a few different oil filter mounts, and they're off the front of the block. We're running a bunch of oil accessories, and we don't have room for a factory filter, so we're using this relocation kit. This small manifold bolts to the block where the original housing used to, and allows us to relocate the oil filter housing to the back of the truck. It also makes it easier to run that oil cooler that I showed earlier. Now that we've got the oil plumbing on this thing done, it means we actually get to put some oil into it, and although we don't get to fire it up yet, we are getting very close. Ford's Coyote platform calls for a number of different oil weights, so I've chosen 10W30 as a happy medium. I've opted to use Pennzoil's Platinum Full Synthetic Oil for this project, because it's meant for applications just like this one. One of the coolest parts about Pennzoil Platinum is the fact that it's made from natural gas, not crude oil, making it the first synthetic oil of its kind. It's also formulated with horsepower in mind, by keeping oil temps at their lowest as well as friction at the bare minimum. I'm excited to be working with Pennzoil on this project, and with the fluids topped off, we're getting closer and closer to actually firing this thing up. We just have a little bit of plumbing to do, and we need that wiring harness and standalone system. But aside from those, we're pretty much done, so it's time for a little bit of show and tell. A lot of you guys had questions about the Centerlocks system on this truck, and as I mentioned, we're going to be retaining it for our new wheels coming here in about a week. The single center nut uses a massive 3¼ inch socket, and you need a very serious torque wrench to turn it. No, not that one. You're going to need one of these. A more than 4-foot long torque wrench that's capable of 600 pounds of torque. While we don't actually max this thing out, we get relatively close. The Centerlocks system on the Model A gets torqued all the way down to 420 foot-pounds of torque. Loosening one of these up takes every bit of my body weight. Now, what I find kind of interesting and thought it'd be kind of cool to share is that here on the passenger side of the car, we have left-hand threaded nuts. And if you didn't know, these tick marks on the points of a nut typically indicate left-hand threads or reverse threads. Now, the idea here is to keep these from loosening up under use. Because the wheels rotate, it would want to try to loosen these up under aggressive use. But what's kind of backwards, at least when you think about it on the surface, is that here on this side of the car, It's a left-hand thread. We're tightening towards the back of the car, and that's always how it's done. You tighten the center lock nut towards the back of the car if you're going to have reverse threads on one side. So if we go back over to the driver's side of the car, as you guys saw on video, this one is threaded normally like you would expect. So there's your center lock tidbit for the day. All right, end of the episode. We made it, we're here, and you guys have some questions about that. Some of you spotted it in the last episode, and considering a few days ago that I mentioned I have a new project to unveil, some of you guys think you're on to me, but you're not. Nope, this one belongs to my buddy John. It might start living here at the shop. I'm gonna do some rearranging in the back, see if I can fit one more 4-post lift, and he's probably gonna store it here. It's a pretty cool car. I think it's a 78 or a 77 GTB, carbureted black, obviously. We're gonna be tinkering with it in the future, and you will see it in an upcoming episode with some 308 content. We're gonna do a pretty sweet compare and contrast about the progress we've made and some of the changes that we've made so far, because it's pretty cool to be able to look at a stock one now that we've made so many big changes. I'm pretty excited about it. Leave me a comment if you guys are too. With all that said, we're done with this one. I will catch you guys at the end of the week. I don't know exactly what we're gonna do yet. We'll find out when we get there. I'll see you then. Thanks as always for the support. Oh, and no, those aren't my wheels.